Okay, great. Let's go ahead and begin. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining the virtual session for the Proposal Development Workshop for the Academy of Management Perspectives. For those of you who are interested in publishing in AMP or in the right place, if you found yourself in the wrong place, you are free to sign out. This session will be roughly about an hour and 45 minutes. It will be divided into two parts. First, we will have a discussion where I will talk about the journal and what it takes to publish in the journal. I will introduce my editorial team in a short while. And then we will go into a sort of hands-on session where you'll have a bit of time to think through the topic you want to write on. And then we will do breakouts. And we have a number of associate editors with us from the journal who will help facilitate each of the breakout sessions. So you will be assigned to a breakout room later on. And it's a random assignment, right? So go ahead and when you are invited to join the breakout room, join the breakout room, and an associate editor will join you to help facilitate the session. So my name is Phil Fan. And I'm the editor for AMP. What I would like to do is to next introduce very quickly the editorial team. We have Irina Burns. She's the Senior Managing Editor at the Academy of Management Publications Office. She handles the back office and the managing editorial functions of AMP. We have Yaping Kong from the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. Right now it's about 1 a.m. in the morning, so forgive him if he's not here. He's a very enthusiastic editor, by the way, just 1 a.m., not very easy to be very enthusiastic. Susanna Cavul from San Jose State University and LSE. Gideon Markman from Colorado State University. Gideon, I believe, is here with us. Marie-Louise Moores from Copenhagen Business School. Sharon Toka from Tel Aviv University, Margaret Wiesemer from University of California at Irvine, and then Jeff Wood from the University of Western Ontario, or I guess it's now Western University in Ontario in Canada. Yeah. So this is a very capable team. These are people who have had extensive experience publishing in the best journals in management, and they have been asked to serve on AMP because of not only their wide and deep knowledge, but they have a very open-minded approach to publishing in a journal like AMP, which is required. So I'm going to talk a little bit about AMP. I'm going to invite you to type any questions you might have into the chat. And if you want to know where to find the chat, it will be on the the AOM website through which you came to this channel. What's going to happen is both Irina and Susan will help me monitor the chat. And I will pause from time to time and ask if there are any questions, and I will try to take questions as we go along. So here is a very, very brief summary of the mission. I'm not going to read this thing, but I'm going to highlight a couple of things. So those of you who have not published in AMP before, I strongly suggest that you go to the AMP website. It's www.aom.org/AMP, and that's a /AMP. And I would invite you to take a look at the mission very carefully. If you want an illustration of how the mission is translated into actual publications, I would also invite you to read the last 2 or 3 issues of the journal. You can peruse them very quickly. And there you will, I think, get a good sense of the types of papers that we publish. Is very, very broad because the journal is designed to serve the membership of the Academy, which is it's a very broad membership. We have 22 or 23 different divisions, dozens of interest groups, so on and so forth, on almost every single discipline that is directly or indirectly related to management and the study of management. Now, the AMP's mission specifically is to publish papers with policy implications. So there are two things you need to note from this mission statement. Number one, AMP is not a journal of public policy. There are lots and lots of journals of public policy. AMP is not one of them. It is a management journal, and it is specifically a journal that serves the management scholar. The policy aspect comes into play because we believe, the Academy believes, that management scholarship should have a much broader impact beyond just, you know, the practice and the study of management of business, right? I mean, if the things that we do are supposed to be important, it should be meaningful to the broader community. And in this particular instance, specifically to those in the community that make policy that affects the community, to members of the community for whom certain topics are of public interest. A lot of things that we study in management have important public interest dimensions attached to it. So the journal is designed to give a place, a voice, right, for those aspects of the scholarship that impinge the public interest and public policy and the public domain. Now, because it is a management journal, right, generally speaking, the questions that arise, which may be interesting to the public, they tend to arise from research in management, right? It is a journal that publishes papers that is based on evidence that has been collected by scholars over, you know, decades. It is also a journal that is focused on looking critically at that evidence to see if, in fact, that evidence might actually be applied or cannot be applied or applied only to a limited extent to certain topics the moment they move into the public domain or when they begin speaking to issues in the public domain. So it is a journal that, again, is based on evidence, but it is focused on a couple of things. Number one, to critically assess, and by critical, I don't mean critical theory, I mean critical in the sense of looking at the evidence and examining the preponderance of the evidence and seeing if, in fact, the evidence is supportive of a particular question that you want to ask, correct? And if it isn't, why is that? And then how would one then approach the mismatch between the evidence and the position that you're taking as a scholar, as an expert in this particular field? In order to be evidence-based, you obviously have to interrogate the evidence. And by evidence, I don't mean simply the empirical evidence. This is not an empirical journal, but you look at the empirical work that has been done. And of course, you look at the theoretical perspectives and the theoretical frameworks that have been used to organize the empirical evidence, to answer questions, okay? And I'm gonna go through in quite good detail the anatomy of an award-winning paper to illustrate what I'm talking about. The other aspect of AMP papers, if you look at them, again, is because there is a policy angle to them, right? The questions that are being raised in these papers have to be compelling on at least two dimensions. There might be other dimensions. Number one, the first dimension is that it is compelling because these questions may have been answered in a very traditional approach, say from a theoretical and empirical perspective, but then when applied from a different point of view or when you use a different lens, it seems like maybe the answers are not so certain after all, right? So those papers are particularly interesting. You know, we think we know something, but in fact, we don't actually know it if we look at it from a slightly different angle, okay? And this is where the journal becomes very interesting because it really encourages and invites multidisciplinary and perspectives from other disciplines that may not necessarily consider management a primary domain for their work. So if you work with a scholar in anthropology, for example, they may have a very different take on culture. And the way they look at culture may actually be quite different from the way we, for example, look at organization culture, right? Or group culture or team culture, and so on and so forth, or national culture. And so these kinds of perspectives are particularly interesting to us. And we are starting to see many submissions from fields in neuroscience, for example, that we don't typically see in the traditional management journals. And the reason we welcome these kinds of submissions is because we want to expand the conversation beyond, management scholars talking to other management scholars, right? Because fields of inquiry are typically multidisciplinary and in some instances even transdisciplinary, right? They don't just cross boundaries, but they sometimes destroy boundaries. And then ultimately these papers, because they're focused on the scholar, need to have a very strong statement about, well, what do we do? You've highlighted a question that may have been contradicted by evidence or contradicted by logic, from another perspective. What do we do about that? How do we advance scholarship around that particular question? So we want your discussions to go fairly deep into things like implications and future research. So the way I describe AMP publications, because AMP doesn't publish empirical work and neither does it publish formal theory building, as you might find in the Academy of Management review, what we look for is that section in your typical academic paper called discussion and implications, right? So if you think of a typical empirical paper, that section might contribute maybe 10%, 15%, at most 20% of a paper, right? In an AMP contribution, that section is going to be the vast majority of the paper, right? It's going to be 60 to 70% of the paper, right? You establish the evidence very quickly, you make a convincing argument, and then the rest of the paper is around the discussion of what it means for the scholar, what it might mean for the policymaker. Okay, so AMP publications are like that. And there are implications for how you write and the style and the manner in which you write if you want to be successful. So some very quick statistics. The latest impact factor for AMP is slightly over 5. I know that in some places, these kinds of metrics matter. In other places, they matter less. But there is that information for you. But I think what is more important and more interesting is who is or where is the research in AMP being cited? And if you go to the right-hand side of this presentation, you will see that beyond the traditional management, business, and economics and psychology fields, that increasing numbers of citations come from other domains. Library science, for example, public administration, political science, geography, right? Hospitality, interesting, industrial engineering. So, this journal was designed to be a voice of the academy to the broader discipline, and at the same time, a place, if you will, a discussion room for academy scholars to talk to one another. And the way we describe the audience for this journal would be the non-specialist management scholar or the non-specialist scholar more generally. By non-specialist, I mean that if you're, for example, HR scholar, you want to write in a way that is accessible to the non-HR scholar, right? So I'm not talking about dumbing down the ideas. I'm saying that you need to write in a way to avoid jargon so that if I was a strategy person or if I was an operations person or if I was a finance person, I can read your article and I can appreciate the arguments and I can feel compelled to think more or compelled to investigate further, right? So that's what we want to try to achieve. We want to broaden the conversation beyond sort of the traditional academy membership. That's, a very important editorial function of the journal. So what are the features of an AMP contribution? First of all, it is an authoritative exposition of a scholarly issue, right? And by authoritative, I mean very specifically, it's based on the evidence and you're the expert telling us who are intellectually interested, but we are not the experts, it's not our discipline. You tell us what we should think about this problem. Why is this problem important to me as a bystander, as an observer? And how should I think about the problem? And what is the evidence that I should use in order to understand the problem better? Okay, so it's authoritative in that sense. Now, the question has to be compelling, and typically compelling questions come from these gaps that we identify. It's sort of obvious, right? So here I've got sort of 4 different kinds of gaps, right? You have a theory practice, theory, data theory, policy theory gap. I mean, these are just some examples. As long as you identify some kind of inconsistency, some kind of a gap, some kind of a question that we thought we knew or that we thought had already been answered, but in fact is really equivocal, right? Is not quite as answered as we thought, that's a good place to start. Now, granted, whether it's compelling or not does depend on writing, right? So it's just like with every argument. You know, the one who wins the argument is the one that can convince the other party that point of view holds water or has some validity attached to it, and it is important enough for the other party to listen. So there is a lot about the art of writing, the art of argumentation, the art of discourse, right, that typifies a good AMP contribution. And that is not exactly the same thing as scientific writing in the way that we have necessarily been trained, right? If you think of an empirical paper, there are very clear markers or very clear benchmarks on what, you know, a good methods discussion looks like, a good hypothesis looks like, a good literature review looks like. All that stuff is very important, and you can sort of learn that from a very technical, in a very technical sort of a way. AMP contributions, you know, there's some technicalities, but it's also a lot of, it's an art form to be able to write like that, okay? And you get good at it by doing it a lot. And generally speaking, successful authors are those who have been around the block a few times, so to speak, right? They've written lots and lots of papers in a traditional way, and they have deep experience that allows them to articulate an idea in a very compelling fashion. All right, these papers, again, are problem-driven, and more importantly, ultimately, a good AMP contribution always has a very strong section on the implications for these ideas, okay? Now, typically, if you write, let's say, an empirical paper, you might discuss implications for the empirical evidence or implications for the methodology, and these things again tend to be somewhat technical. You know, you think a little bit about what it means, and then you can sort of write that up. The implications of an AMP paper are a little bit broader than this. Okay, it's not just about, you know, the technical implications of the paper. It could be implications for the scholar. And the best implications are those that you are able to broaden out beyond a particular discipline. So if I was a HR person and I'm talking about, let's say, gig work or temporary work, right, or self-employment, which is not entrepreneurial work, okay, what is the implication for economics? So what is the implication for a scholar who's doing operations research? Okay, so those kinds of discussions are very interesting because, again, they broaden the audience for your work beyond, you know, the people who normally read, you know, in the discipline. So, and what is, you know, what AMP is not is sort of the, you know, the opposite of what it is, and this sort of just reflects a lot of the submissions that we get, which ends up getting desk rejected, right? So remember I said AMP contributions are evidence-based, but they're not just straight literature reviews, okay? They're not straight literature reviews. They're clearly not sort of empirical papers that are trying to test a theory, you know, from a single source of data, for example. You know, they are not sort of formal theorizing. Oftentimes, you might present a certain perspective about a problem or an argument, but there's really no formal theorizing, right? Sometimes the question is so general that you're not really talking about trying to build a theoretical model, right? You're just raising issues that you're trying to get other scholars to think more carefully about, to maybe question their own work or question their own perspectives. Okay, so now it doesn't mean that you don't do literature reviews. It doesn't mean that you can't refer to data that exists, in other publications, not data, but empirical results in other publications, it doesn't mean that you cannot discuss by example some case studies, but these papers are not just those things, all right? And more importantly, AMP papers are not soapboxes, meaning if you have an itch to scratch or if you have a complaint to make, if you want to do that, that's fine, but then again, you have to do it, in a scholarly discussion based on empirical evidence and based on logic that a reviewer and a reader can follow. Okay, so that's really important. I do get a number of submissions sometimes coming in from people who they just have a complaint. They don't like what's going on, so they write a paper around that. That's fine, but it doesn't really go anywhere, right? It doesn't tell us what do we do next as scholars. How do we improve the research? Where do we go from here? And so those kinds of papers don't typically see the light of day at AMP. Now, there are other journal outlets for those kinds of papers, and we're always very careful to suggest that if you are interested in publishing that kind of work, that there are other outlets to do that, but it simply wouldn't fit AMP. Now, this aspect of an AMP publication is very, very important, and I keep hammering on this because we oftentimes find that we end up desk rejecting papers, even papers that have already gone through review, because they never quite get to this point, which is accessibility. Okay? Remember, if your target audience is the non-specialist management scholar, you have to write to that audience, right? So first of all, that means that you are addressing an intelligent reader. Okay, so I'm not asking authors to sort of dumb down their arguments or to simplify them. I'm just saying that given the choice between two words, one that is jargon and one that is jargon-free, you go with the jargon-free option. Secondly, the paper needs to have all these characteristics. It's got to be cogent, right? So we're not looking for 50, 60, 70 pages. Right, typical good submission is about 35 to 40 pages double spaced. Around there, we don't have strict page limits. But once you start breaking, 45, 50 pages, then you better have a lot of very, very good things to say. Otherwise, it does get very repetitive and you're going to lose people's attention. It needs to be coherent and logical, obviously, right? So if you have a premise, you've got to carry through the argument in the premise with the supporting evidence and then some conclusion that connects all those pieces together, right? And then, of course, your implication has to be, has to fall out of those conclusions. So, in some sense, I'm talking about sort of good writing, but I have to say, it's not easy, all right? I mean, I say it like, well, it's sort of obvious, but in fact, it's not that easy. You have to work at it. Okay, now this part, point 3 is the one, it turns out interestingly, is probably the most difficult. Writing in plain English, right? You have to be really good in English to be able to write in plain English. And the way we try to define plain English, the metric for that is what is known as the Fleisch Reading East score, right? Or the sort of corollary to that, which is the Fleisch-Kincaid grade level. So if you think about the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Economist, right? These are, well-regarded publications. Now, they're not academic publications, but they try to reach a broad audience, and the people who read these publications are presumably somewhat intelligent, okay? Their Fleisch-Kincaid grade level is about 10 or 11, okay? And the reading score is sort of around 50. And here are some examples. Which I like giving because I think they sort of break the mold or break the assumption that anything that is academic has to be very difficult to understand. No. So Feynman's lecture on the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, which is probably one of the most complex constructs or ideas in theoretical physics, right? His lecture reads at about a grade level of 8. Now, grade level 8 is what, like high school, senior high, or something like that, or yeah, something like that, I think. It's high school, okay? The Times of London, New York Times, they publish at a grade reading level of about 10, grade 10. Military documents, at least in the United States, are required by law to be at a readability grade level of 9. Now, these are important documents, right? So what I'm suggesting is the more important your idea, right, the more you need to get it out there because it's compelling, the more accessible it must be, right? And typically we find that when it's very difficult, that when readers or reviewers or editors find it very difficult to understand what you're saying, two things have happened. Number one, you haven't paid enough attention to writing, or number two, you don't actually know what you're writing, right? Because we do get a lot of that. People sort of just parrot what others have written. They parrot an idea that has been out there, and they don't actually think through what it actually means or what it's actually saying. And so when you do that, then you can't really explain very clearly, because if you can, you should be able to teach it to me. Okay, so this part, I would say, is where you would spend, once you get past the original idea and the supporting evidence for the idea and the argument you want to make. This is where you're going to spend a lot of time crafting the paper so that, in fact, it hits the standard. This is very important. Okay. Now, if you want to know how to get those numbers, it's very easy. You can go to Microsoft Word. Most of us use Word now. Go in, the latest version of Word has a functionality called Editor. It used to be Grammar Checker. It's in there. This function has been in Word for 25, 30 years. I mean, as long as Word has been around, I think. And when you do your grammar check at the end, it gives you a dialog box with statistics. Look for the thing called the Fleisch reading score or the Fleisch-Kincaid grade level. And if you want to know how these things are calculated, you can Google it. It's quite fascinating, actually. Okay, so very quickly about the mechanics of submitting to the journal. AMP uses a two-stage editorial process. So unlike a lot of journals, I mean, there's some journals that uses this. We are one of two journals in the Academy portfolio that uses a two-stage editorial process. First, you submit a proposal. So you tell us in about 5 pages, and we will go through an exercise of how you do this later on. You tell us in about 5 pages, what is the question? How are you going to answer the question? Who's it aimed at? Okay, what evidence are you going to use to discuss the question? Okay, so you submit the proposal. The turnaround time for an initial decision is typically about 4 days or so, depending on the season of the year. Sometimes it's 2 days, sometimes it's 5 days. And that decision can be one of three outcomes. One, it's a desk reject, right? So if I get a paper, for example, that proposes to do a number of case studies on a particular topic and say, well, interesting idea, doesn't fit the mission of the journal, right? Or oftentimes what I get, oddly enough, are still papers that basically empirical papers. I'd say, well, maybe the Academy Management Journal could be a better outlet, a better fit for a paper like that. So a lot of the desk rejects have to do with just fit issues, right? Or you ask a question that is unclear to me where that question came from, it's sort of uncompelling. I might send it back to you and say, okay, so you sort of have an idea here. I'd like to know a little bit more if you sort of pique my interest. Rewrite this thing, and I'll give you directions on what I want to see in the rewrite. So you can actually revise the proposal, send it back in. You're not going to have 2 revisions. At most, you get 1 revision. If you don't nail it in the revision, then the proposal is typically rejected. Because that's just a proposal, right? If you can't write a proposal in a compelling fashion, it's unclear, it's unlikely that you're going to do that in a full paper. At least not that particular version of your research question. And of course, the third outcome is your proposal gets accepted. Many proposals will simply get accepted. And the acceptance of a proposal simply means you now have the right to submit the full paper. Now, the full paper will be assigned to one of the associate editors, and it will still undergo full double-blind peer review. The associate editor occasionally could outright reject the paper, reject the paper, right? So when does that happen? Typically that happens when you submit a proposal, the idea looks good, you have a clear picture of what you want to do, but you don't actually do it. So there's a mismatch between what you said you're going to do in the proposal and what you actually did in the full paper. At that point, the associate editor is going to look at it and say, well, you didn't actually do what you say you're going to do. So this is really not the paper that you promised to submit. So it's that's rejected. Or you said what you were going to do, but you actually didn't do it well enough that the odds of it getting a revise in the actual revision process are so low that the associate editor says, look, I'm not going to waste your time because, it takes time to review these things. So to be fair to you as the author, I'm just going to tell you, look, you're not going to get a shot because the odds are just so low. And then, of course, we do that also to preserve reviewer time. Sometimes the associate editor might say, okay, so this looks okay, and I've personally done it maybe a couple of times, but I want you to revise it. So I will sort of give you, the associate editor might give you an initial read and say, before I send it out for review, here are 3 glaring things that you got to fix. If you don't fix this, your review is not going to fly. But if you fix this, your review has a shot. Okay, so rather than an outright reject, the editor might send it back to you to be, for a rewrite, and then you can resubmit the full paper. So on the desk, a number of these things can happen, right? It could be rejected, it could be sent back to you for a rewrite, or it could be sent out for review. So between the acceptance of a proposal and full paper submission is about 90 days. You get 90 days to do it. A lot of people may not take 90 days. Some people take more than 90 days. And if you need more than 90 days, you can always request for more time. We try to keep the deadlines, we try to keep to the deadlines because we want the editorial process to keep going. But if there are really compelling reasons that you can't get it in 90 days, you write to us, and we try to be accommodating as much as possible. And frankly, I don't think we've actually turned down any requests for a short extension. Because if the idea is good enough for full paper to be invited, we want to see your idea, right? We want to see it happen. So we try not to be too post office-like, with this process. It takes roughly about under 60 days for the first review to come back. There's a lot of variance, of course, in the number. The mean is 55 days or so. And then in the first decision, if you get a revision, you typically get 2 months to make the revision for a resubmission. And then the second review is shorter than that, about 47 days, plus minus. Now, as much as possible, right? I don't say this as a guarantee, but editorially, we try our best to make early decisions, definitive decisions, early definitive decisions. What that means is that we're not going to, we try our best not to keep you in multiple rounds of review and revision. Right? So typically we try to call it after the first revision, right? So meaning after the second review, we try to call it, right? If there's no progress or the progress is very marginal, very minimal after the first version, we say, look, clearly something is not working here. Let's cut this off because it's not fair to the author to sort of just keep you on the hook, especially if the editor feels like, the odds are really long here. So that you can turn around the paper and either send it somewhere else or find a different research question or what have you. But if we give you a second revision, right? If you get a positive decision in the second round for a third revision, for a third resubmission, second revision, third resubmission, the signal is really very good. All right, so I would take that very, very seriously. Some authors sort of sit on. I'm sure you hear this from editors all the time, when you get a revise and resubmit, that needs to be a priority. Because if the paper ages for too much, then oftentimes it's not gonna fare well in the review process. Reviewers forget what they did, so on and so forth. So in total, it takes about 85 days, thereabouts, maybe 90 days from a submission of the full paper, assuming that it passes through the revision rounds to first online, all right? And the acceptance rate is roughly about 18% now, which is, pretty decent. But the reason is because we take a very sort of mentoring approach to this, right? So the real gate is at the proposal and then the first round. That's where the gate is. Once you get past the proposal stage in the first round, then typically the process is really a lot more supportive and a lot more mentoring. If the ideas are interesting, if they're good, we want to see it. We want to see it out there. Okay, so we don't take a lot of pleasure, rejecting papers after multiple rounds of review, and we almost never do that. Okay, so that's sort of our commitment to you. What that means is that as an author, your commitment to us is that you take our feedback seriously, from a proposal stage, right? We oftentimes find people will submit a really nice proposal, but they really, frankly, had the paper written up already. It could have been a reject from somewhere else. And so they'll push that in, and then the paper ends up getting rejected because they didn't really take the feedback very seriously. Okay? So we have a responsibility to you, and you have a responsibility to us as the author. All right. So let me just stop here very quickly and ask if you have any questions. Go ahead and type it in a chat box if you have any questions. And then I will take your questions. If there are no questions, I will just keep going in, on the template, the proposal template. Any questions? No questions? All right, just type, and then if I see any questions pop up, I will stop and I'll answer those questions, okay? All right, so if you go to the journal website, so it's www.amp.org/AMP, www.aom.org/AMP, and you look at authors' resources, you will find various examples of paper proposals, templates for paper proposals. Right. So what is in the template? What are the pieces of information that we look for in the 5 pages that we ask you to submit? There are basically 4 major pieces of information, right? Number 1 is obviously the research question. It is very surprising how we get many proposals that don't actually state a question, right? They just launch into the thing and say, I have this itch I need to scratch. I have this problem, all right? And I'm going to answer the problem like that. Well, what is in fact the question? And the question needs to be motivated, right? The questions don't just come out of thin air. They have to be motivated by something. And so you need to talk about what is the motivation behind the question. And typically the motivation, as I said, is some kind of a gap you have identified. I will tell you that a motivation that is not very compelling goes something like this. Topic X has been researched for 20 years, and this aspect of the question or the topic has not been researched before. Okay, that's not a very good motivation. Just because something hasn't been done before doesn't necessarily make it worth doing, right? I mean, there's a reason why people might not ask certain questions. Either they're obvious, they're not terribly interesting or compelling, they're trivial, so on and so forth. So you need to sort of just go beyond the standard argument of, well, I have this question and no one has actually asked this question, so I'm going to ask it. You still have to make an argument why you should ask it, right? Why should you spend your time and the reader's time and the reviewer's time and so on and so forth, addressing this question. So that first piece is very important. That's your first gate, right? Once you're able to write that in a convincing way, and I would suggest that when you start writing a proposal, that you actually get others to read it, especially your colleagues who are not experts in your field, okay? Because if they don't resonate with the question or they don't resonate with why it's important, then you haven't crossed the first gate. So you need to check that off first. The second thing is, the second piece of information that we need is this issue of why this format, why AMP is the right place for you to publish it, right? Because sometimes a compelling question could simply be the result of the lack of good empirical evidence. Okay, so it's an important question. We just don't know. Well, if we just don't know, or if there isn't empirical evidence, then there's not a whole lot of discussion around that, right? It's an empirical question. So, go and collect the data and run the tests, right? And then, verify the evidence, correct? So the perspectives format is very important, like why AMP, right? And I've described to you what are the kinds of things that we publish and what we are trying to achieve. So you need to look at the mission statement and you need to say something about why your question fits what we're trying to do. That's really important. And that's the other piece that oftentimes trips up authors, right? So, and I can tell you it's very obvious. You write a theory paper, it gets bounced at some other journal, and you think, well, I'll send it to AMP because they seem to have sort of easier standards. Not really. Okay, but there's an impression out there. So you send it in, and it's very obvious that you haven't actually thought about why this particular paper would fit a format like AMP. AMP is somewhat unique that way. So you need to think about that, right? Now, there's nothing wrong with submitting a paper that got bounced somewhere else. Maybe it got bounced for lack of fit somewhere else. That's fine. But you still have to figure out whether it fits AMP. And if you think it fits, then you need to write it in a way that makes it very obvious that it's actually part of an AMP publication, right? So you still have to work on it. You can't sort of just take a paper and drop it in thinking that, well, I'll have an easier time. It's sort of obvious when that happens, right? And I don't have a big ego about such things, but I think, why did you just waste your time doing this? Now, AMP papers, so this is the motivation, right? The motivation can be from some data that you saw or some other publication that you have written, and you notice some anomaly, something odd going on. Okay, that could trigger a set of questions which could become a perspectives piece. Okay, so it could be motivated that way, but it's not a paper about data. Okay, it could have been motivated by a systematic review or a meta-analysis or a literature review. The motivation is one thing, but the paper is not about doing these things. Okay, so there's a difference there. So the key is to tell us how is this motivated. It needs to be sort of somewhat non-obvious, right? So a question that is obvious, even if it hasn't been answered before, is not very compelling, right? Because you like with all research papers, you have to answer the so what question. So, all right, so you telling me that this is important, my rejoinder to you is you have to show me it's important, right? Otherwise, in the back of my head, I'm going, well, so what? Okay, you need to answer that question. And then, of course, the final aspect of your paper proposal is you need to say something. Now, again, this is just a proposal. It's not a full paper. So I'm not asking for long discussions about this stuff, right? So even writing the proposal, you need to be somewhat cogent and logical. But the final piece is, well, how is this useful or interesting or important for issues of the public interest? And so rather than just talk specifically about public policy, it doesn't have to be policy per se, all right? Although ultimately we do want you to say something intelligible about what it might mean for somebody who thinks about, the public interest, which are public policymakers. But again, it's not a policy journal, but you want to say something about how this connects to what's going on in the broader community, right, of thinkers, okay? So those are some of the pieces that needs to show up in your 5 pages. Now, the next step is we will actually go through, I will go through sort of a case study, if you will, a very quick breakdown of what a good paper looks like. And I invite you to pick up any issue of the journal and just read through them. You will find that the topics are very broad. We have a very broad audience. The topics are very varied with a very broad audience, but they all have very similar characteristics. Okay, any questions so far? Any questions? No questions? Okay, let's go through an anatomy of an AMP paper. Now this, I need to update this, but they're all very similar actually. This is an award-winning paper from the 2017 volume. It's the 2017 years, volume 31, number 3, and it's entitled Micro Entrepreneurs, Dependent Contractors, and INSTASERFS, Understanding the Online Labor Platform Workforce. And it's by Christine Kuhn and Amir Malaki. So first of all, this was sort of like a really interesting paper. By the way, it was an award-winning paper. The awards are picked by an independent committee that do not comprise the editorial team. Okay, so it's an independent committee of 3 senior scholars who will poll the broader editorial board of 50, 60 individuals, and they will actually read the papers themselves. So it's a very rigorous process the way we pick these papers. Why was this interesting? First of all, it's trying to understand a phenomenon that has been sort of growing for some time. These micro entrepreneurs, Uber drivers, for example, independent Amazon delivery drivers, the gig workforce. Okay, so this is a growing phenomenon, has been growing for some time. All of a sudden has become a major part of the economy now in hindsight, but this was back in 2017. And so these authors were trying to sort of understand, we think of the gig workforce a certain way as temporary or online labor, okay? And they are basically saying, that's not actually a good way of thinking about it, all right? First of all, this workforce doesn't exist without the technology to make them exist. I mean, there have been temp work for the longest time. We're not talking about temp work here. We're talking about the technology-enabled workforce, and it's a very specific kind of a technology-enabled workforce. Okay, so they sort of talk about this as a very distinctive phenomenon. And you might be tempted to think, well, that's a very specific kind of a question. Like, why should anybody care? Well, people should care because, number one, it's a big part of the economy now, right, around the world. And even back in 2017, you could see it was starting to grow. These companies represent a good chunk of the capitalization of the stock market. Number two, it's a phenomenon that has been expanding. So it's not just confined to a particular industry, it's showing up in all kinds of industries. So they sort of start by saying, look, it's not that esoteric, it's pretty important. And by the way we've thought about this has been sort of not quite correct. And so they make an argument why it's not correct. So right off the bat, you read something like you think, okay, now that's interesting, right? Is it about formal theorizing? No. Is there data in here? Well, they cite studies that have been done and so on and so forth, but this is not a study about a particular data source, right? That would have been too narrow. That would have been too specific. That would have been esoteric. So they start with the problem statement. Okay, so you've got sort of two pieces of the problem statement in this particular paper. One is you have these labor platform firms, right? The gig economy, the Airbnb, not the Airbnbs, the Ubers, right? That employ these people. So they think of themselves as a technology company, right? They're not hiring people, they're just providing the technology. And there's been a lot of arguments about whether, in fact, they are full-time employers or not. And as you can see, even the regulation has changed. The state of California, for example, has a regulation that says, no, these are full-time employees. Other states, they don't. And around the world, that argument continues to be made. So on the one hand, you have the technology, and then on the other hand, you have the people who use the technology. So are these independent contractors? Are they employees? Are they gig workers? Are they temp workers? Are they doing this as a hobby? So on and so forth. So there are all these dimensions. And so they lay this out and they say, well, if you look at all these things together, guess what? You're looking at a very weird phenomenon. Weird, I mean, that's my own word, right? They're saying it's a very unique situation, right? In the context of labor, right? And labor economics, this is a very unique phenomenon that we're looking at. And the only way to understand this phenomenon is you need a certain kind of a perspective. So they talk about their approach to the perspective, right? So they're going to look at a number of things. They first of all look at the nature of these online platforms. So that's the technology piece. And it turns out that it's actually quite subtle. That not all of these, all of these online labor platforms, they're all the same. And there are important distinctions that actually make the implications of what kind of a platform you're talking about different from each other, right? The second thing is they look at, specifically in these terms of in the context of these platforms, the structure and the operational choices of the platforms, the way they engage the worker, right? The way they enable the worker to use the platform, the way the worker makes money out of this platform. And they're all different, not all, but they're different enough that it's not one monolithic phenomenon. So they talk about that. So they talk in terms of worker autonomy, their performance incentives, and the degree of economic dependence on the firm. So you have work autonomy, your ability to decide when you work and when you don't work, but also how dependent you are economically on these platforms. So if you got off the platform, can you still do the work? Can you still drive your car if you don't sign up, if you quit Uber? Well, you can drive your car, but can you make money doing it without Uber, right? So those are, it's very subtle arguments. So then they go and talk about describing what these online platforms are. Now, it's very clear that when you look at this discussion, that these are experts. Now, I don't do background checks of authors coming in, right? So I don't know whether you are, the author is an expert or not, but when I read, I can tell that, whether they have spent 30 years looking at this problem, the problem is not 30 years old, or whether they have spent a lot of time and effort up front educating themselves on this thing and becoming real experts, okay? You can tell by the description, right? By the way they write it up, by the way they write it so that it's accessible, right? You become an expert when you can actually teach this. So as most people were reading this, they were getting education. So that's really the first sign of a good paper. Are you getting educated as you're reading this paper, right? I don't consider I consider myself, I guess, an educated bystander, but I'm not an expert on online labor platforms. These people educated me as well. They did with the reviewers and, obviously with the committee that decided this was the best paper for 2016. And then, so they describe the platform, then they say, okay, now how are we going to understand the technicalities of this in the context of a framework for slotting in all these different kinds of workers and seeing how the workers and the platforms interact with one another and the implications for that interaction. So they provide you a framework. Now, this is not a theory, right? All a framework is an organizing rubric. It's a way of thinking about a complex phenomenon, right? It's not a theory in the sense that they're not theorizing cause and effect. They're just saying, look, here is the phenomenon. It's pretty complex. This is how you think about it in very clear terms. I don't want to use the word simple. It's not simple, but it's very clear, okay? And they talk about the dimensions of this framework, right? So it's sort of a standard 2x2. Interesting, right? Now, it's not really a 2x2. It's just an organizing. It's a bunch of boxes in which you categorize these different aspects of the work dimensions: autonomy versus incentives and dependence on a platform. Okay, so they go through that discussion and then they finally say, okay, so now if you accept what we're saying about the uniqueness of this phenomenon and how it actually influences work and how we should think about these kinds of workers, they're not just temp workers or they're not just quote unquote gig workers. What does that mean? What does that mean in terms of the way we think of flexibility in the workplace? What does that mean when we think about worker satisfaction, commitment? These are topics, these are constructs that have been studied a long time in HR, right? Turnover, worker commitment, embeddedness, all that stuff. Well, they take all that and they say, if you accept what we're saying, then you actually have to rethink some of these constructs. So it's very powerful because now it's asking both the HR researcher as well as other researchers who are interested in this kind of phenomenon. So if I'm an IT, information technology or information systems researcher, and I'm interested in the technology, what this paper is telling me is that I can't just think of the technology and forget the workers that rely on the technology or use the technology, that the value of the technology, the way I think of the technology has to be deeply connected to the way I understand the workers that use this technology or depend on this technology for a living. That's pretty powerful. Because now I've started crossing boundaries. I've started breaking down these boundaries. I mean, I talk like that. Like I wish I'd written this paper, It's one of those things you look at it and say, man, that is really cool. I wish I'd written it. And I think a lot of editors who get excited about papers that they read, they have this very similar kind of reaction, okay? And then finally, of course, they end by saying, here are some very specific questions for future research. Now, these are just copy and paste. I mean, the discussion is a little bit longer than this, all right? So constructs like procedural justice, we talk about procedural justice, right? If you're a HR or OB or, even in strategy, I've seen papers on procedural justice and they raise that and say, what does this mean in terms of procedural justice, that construct in this world that we're living in now? The thing with worker attitudes and firm outcomes. So if you're a policy maker, and it turns out that policymakers care about this thing. Okay, as I said, the state of California has now basically said these are full-time employees, going to pay them benefits, etc. That's pretty remarkable. And I believe California only came out with that rule maybe last year. And this paper was written in 2017. I'm not saying that this paper caused that rule to happen, but they sort of foresaw a lot of these things that were happening, in the policy world. All right. So final conclusions, right? Not all papers follow this structure, but they have these characteristics. They're relevant. The question is compelling, it's problem-driven, right? There is deep understanding. It's very obvious when you read the paper that these authors know what they're talking about, right? They're not parroting somebody else's ideas, right? I mean, they may not have invented the gig economy, but they clearly spent a lot of time understanding the nuances and were able to explain it. It's also forward-looking, right? It's really focused on getting us to rethink what we thought we knew about certain constructs and certain concepts, in these well-defined fields. And most importantly, it's really easy to read, right? I mean, so this is the way I think about a good AMP paper. After reading it, you feel smart. All right? All right? A good AMP paper, when anybody who reads a good AMP paper, when they're done with it, they feel, boy, I really learned something. I feel smart, right? I understood, and I can either agree or disagree and know why. And it actually causes me to think about the topic, right? I didn't just throw it aside and say, yeah, I was okay. Okay. So when you can make the reader feel smart, when you can make the reviewer feel smart, you nailed it. All right. So I'm gonna stop here. I'm gonna ask if there are any questions. Okay. So if there are no questions, we're on time. So we're about an hour. And so for the next 45 minutes or so, we're going to actually do the exercise. So I hope that those of you who came with the topic in mind, right? It doesn't have to be written down in a formal way, but you have a topic. I'm going to take you through the process. And again, we have the associate editors here who will help you, in the discussion room, think through. So I don't see any questions in the chat box. If you have any questions, again, please type it in, and then at any time, I'm more than happy to take those questions. Okay, the next piece is we're going to do an exercise. Submitting the AMP proposal for a paper. This is for individual submission, okay? All right, so there are 4 pieces. If you go to the website, you see some templates. There are sort of 4 pieces to the template, right? First of all, I'm going to repeat this when I send you off to do your homework. Number 1, the idea, right? You've got to be very specific about asking the question. So if you can state, so I typically ask authors if they can state the research question in 10 words or less, that's good. Try that. Okay, it's not always easy, but try your best. Write the research question, state it in 10 words or less. Okay, if you can do that, that means you've actually gone through the process of really refining it and focusing it. That's really important because you want the editor, you want the reviewer. So you don't want the reviewer or the editor to interpret what you mean, right? You have to tell them what you mean, and you need to make sure that they are hearing what you're trying to say. Okay, so this first step is very important. What is the idea? Why is it important? Why is it innovative? So you got to motivate it, right? Where did you get this idea from? The second thing is the importance of that idea. Okay, so this is where you want to just very briefly describe why is this important, because we thought we knew X, and in fact it's Y, and here's why I think it's Y. All right, the evidence of topic X says this. And actually, if we just looked at the evidence a different way, the conclusions are completely different. All right? So whatever it is that you want to bring to bear to support the importance of the idea, this needs to be done. All right? So don't just launch into describing the idea just yet. Right? Tell us why it's important. And then the third piece, and again, this is just mirroring what I've already just said earlier about what are the important elements to a proposal, right? This is the formal structure. Who are you talking to? here, like what is the audience? And the more specific, the better. So clearly, your paper is going to be reviewed by at least one person who's going to be an expert in your field. So you need to talk to that person, right? The expert in your field. But you also need to talk to the non-expert scholar. Okay, so this is where you got to think a little bit. Go back to that example I gave you, right? So these are HR people thinking about the HR problem of gig work. But clearly the paper has implications for people who look at information science or information systems or technology. Clearly it does. Clearly it also has some importance for people who think about labor laws. Okay? Now they sort of anticipated what happened, I think, without actually saying that, maybe these are employees, they're not gig workers, but clearly that audience was in their mind. So you need to highlight that audience. And you want to try to be specific. How are you going to communicate your idea? Okay. Now, this is where a lot of times a proposal ends up getting rejected because it's very obvious that maybe the paper is an empirical paper. I had this big data set and I ran a bunch of tests and I found X. Great. Not an A&P contribution. Or I conducted 15 case studies and came to some conclusion, which is Y. Great, not an A&P contribution. Okay, so how you're going to communicate the idea is very important. So you talk about the basis of evidence you're going to draw from. Again, this is not literature review, so it's only 5 pages. But you need to say, okay, I'm going to use the literature in this domain in anthropology, by these key authors who basically had this to say. And I'm going to apply this perspective to it. So you're going to sort of give me a rough sketch of the recipe, if you will, right? I don't need the recipe, but you're going to tell me these are the basic ingredients in the recipe, and this is how I'm going to communicate my idea to you. 4 pieces in the template. Okay, any questions there? No, all right, let's go ahead and then do it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask you, so you can consider this a short break as well. If